And without further ado, you're here to see The Battle for Free Speech on the Internet by Matthew Prince. Welcome, Matthew.
Thanks, Brian. Brian and I were chatting before, and I confessed to him that I've been dreading giving this talk for I don't know, the last 4 months or however long we've known that I was going to give it, and he said, why is that? And I said, well, at the end of the day, no good comes of this. It can only be make people more upset on one side or another. And we've received over the last little bit a number of sort of feedback of people who are going to be the audience. One of the more hyperbolic said that he was going to bring his pitchfork with him. So I'm sort of scanning the audience looking for pitchforks, and so far I don't see it, which is good. I wanted to tell you a little bit about how we think of the role of free speech on the internet, what the challenges of free speech are on the internet, and what the right role for infrastructure providers like Cloudflare is as we're thinking about the content that traverses our network. And so, when we first started coming to Black Hat a few years ago, people didn't know what Cloudflare was. I think most people do, but in case you don't, we launched in 2010. September will be our 5th birthday. Our mission is to help build a better internet. And so if I encounter you at a cocktail party and I think you're interesting, that's what I would tell you we do as a company. If I don't think that you're as interesting and I want to sort of end the conversation quickly, I say that we make the internet faster and we protect websites from bad guys. We have over 2 million customers, actually closer to 3 million. Between 5 and 10% of all web requests globally flow through our network, which means that there are a lot of things that flow through our network, some of which are things that you guys all know and love, some of which are things that again, would make you blush or worse. So at a high level, what we do, and this is the grandmother-friendly, not the Black Hat-friendly diagram, is we put ourselves in the traffic stream between content. We're not actually the host of that content, but we're something like, one of the people on our team describes us as kind of a network with benefits, where we can make your content faster, protect it from things like denial of service attacks, add a virtual WAF that's in the system, and we do that all as a service through a global network around the world. Inherent then to our business is that we have to be trustworthy. We have to be something which people trust, because if we weren't, there are any number of evil things that we could potentially do. We could modify the content as it actually flows through our network. We could spy on people. We could sell the data that comes off of that network, all of which would be particularly untrustworthy things to do, and would be very quick ends to our business. And so we don't do those things. But inherent to our business from the beginning, what we knew when we launched was, if you are going to trust that all of the traffic to your infrastructure is going to pass through our network, that we have to be trustworthy beyond reproach, which is sometimes really kind of difficult, and it's a strange place to start a talk like this, talking about trustworthiness, and talk about our friends from Lulzsec, who were an early Cloudflare customer. It was quite surprising, actually, when they signed up. We had no idea at the time what Lulzsec was or who they were until customers started writing into us. Other customers started writing into us saying, how can you possibly let this hacker group be on your network? And there was a period of about 23 days where Lulzsec actually used our network, published a bunch of things that were quite troubling to us. The information about police officers, data that they had stolen from Sony, and again, all of this sat behind our network while we weren't the actual host of that content. It was flowing over the pipes that we basically controlled. This was a particularly challenging moment when they attacked CIA.gov and took it offline. And as I joked at the time, we made a lot of friends in the government that day. And what it forced us to do was really think about what our role was as a provider. Were we going to be the content police that said, oh, this is a bad thing, and we're going to take it off the internet because we judge it to be bad? Or were we going to be the anarchists that said all content is good and you should just leave things up no matter what? Or was the right line somewhere in between those places? And that's a question we continue to struggle with and continue to think about to this very day. And it's in part because we end up finding ourselves with some very strange friends, because we have become somewhat of a Switzerland of the internet, saying that our position is that we're not going to pick necessarily one side or the other. And because Cloudflare has made it so easy for organizations to sign up, oftentimes we find ourselves with very strange bedfellows using our network at the same time. So for example, Hamas and the Israeli Defense Force. Sometimes there are attacks that are launched at both of these organizations, and back in our more playful days, I would say, we would sometimes put the two organizations on the same IP address. The sort of pro-Ukrainian forces and the sort of pro-Russian separatist forces both use Cloudflare. The major newspaper publications that are essentially broadcasting the propaganda from the two different sides of that are both Cloudflare customers. The state of Missouri and the hacking group Anonymous both use this. When the protests over Ferguson, Missouri really took off, and the city of Ferguson is actually a customer as well, Anonymous actually DDoSed the state resources. They signed up for us. We helped protect them, keep them online. And then on the same side, Anonymous, if you're a young hacker and you want to sort of prove your chops, knocking off one of the major Anon boards is a way of kind of showing that you've got some credibility. And so again, the hacking group Anonymous uses us. And even in this case, Occupy Wall Street and Goldman Sachs, again, radical extremes. Pick who on either of these you think is the good guy and the bad guy, but it's pretty amazing that across the board, these both organizations are using us to help protect their network. Goldman's actually kind of an interesting story, how they came to be us as a customer. It actually started with a bell that we used to have in our office back in 2011, and the bell would go off anytime someone would sign up for the service. And I remember very distinctly the chain of events that led to Goldman Sachs becoming a customer. And of all the things that started off with, it was the bell going off announcing that we had our first Turkish escort site using Cloudflare. And I have to tell you that as I was putting these slides together, and I really was not looking forward to this talk, so at 5 a.m. this morning, the hardest part of putting this talk together was finding a version of a Turkish escort site which was safe enough to display here, but still conveyed some of the challenges that we faced. And what was interesting was it wasn't just one Turkish escort site. Over the course of 2 weeks, we had 150 Turkish escort sites. In fact, there were teams that sort of said, is this like a segment of of customers that we should start targeting? And if curiosity finally got the better of us, and so we got one of the webmasters from the Turkish escort sites on the phone. We said, first, how'd you ever hear about us? We don't do any marketing, really. We certainly don't do any marketing to Turkish escort sites. And then secondly, what's going on? Is this a pissed off customer, somebody's wife that's angry? What's going on with this? And they said, first of all, thank you so much. We've had this huge problem. Cloudflare is the first thing that's been able to help. We heard about you because one of our friends moonlights as a webmaster for the Turkish escort industry, reads TechCrunch, and read about you guys, and so we signed up. And then in terms of the problem, Turkey is a really fascinating country. And as you go further west in the country, it's very European. They don't really love what we do, but they tolerate it. But as you move further east in the country, it becomes much more conservative, much more fundamentalist Muslim, and they see us as sort of the epitome of everything which is wrong with the Western world. And so when they're bored, they launch these attacks against us, and they knock us offline, and we've never had anything that we could use to actually defend ourselves until Cloudflare, and you saved us, but there's not a lot of money in Turkish escorts, so we're just using the free version of your service. Is that okay? And we said, sure. And we watched, actually, over the course of the next year, as the attacks against the Turkish escorts got better and better and more sophisticated and more interesting. And our system is designed so it continuously learns from all of these attacks. And almost to the day, a year later, we had another organization sign up. I have to confess that when the Dutch gentleman called from Baku, Azerbaijan, saying that the contest was under attack and we needed to help them get it back online, that I had no idea what Eurovision is. Anyone in the audience who's from Europe knows that it is an unescapable force. It's sort of like, for the Americans in the audience, it's kind of like American Idol, but with nationalism, where each country gets to send their own representative to participate in this song contest, and then there's this complicated voting scheme, a lot of which goes on online, where people can vote for it. And again, when the gentleman from Baku, Azerbaijan was explaining this to me over the phone, I just said, yeah, just sign up. What I didn't know is that Eurovision is the second, it's the largest non-sporting event by viewership. It's only trumped by the Olympics and the World Cup when they're online. It gets twice the viewership of the Super Bowl. And what had happened was that they were down to the finals of this. There were 6 finalists in the contest. And there was a group that was upset that one of the final contestants, one of the final 6, was gay. And so they launched an attack to, as they issued a press release saying, wipe Eurovision off the internet. Signed up for us, we were able to help protect them. But the thing that was the most interesting about it was that the system automatically recognized who was behind the attacks, and they're like, oh, we know these guys. These are the Turkish escort attackers. And it was the exact same groups with the exact same strategies. And if you look at Baku, Azerbaijan, it's sort of nestled right in there with eastern Turkey. What happened then 6 months later in the fall of 2012 is when our friends at Goldman reached out. There was a series of attacks targeting the U.S. financial industry that were launched one after another, knocking them offline. And a CISO at another bank, actually not Goldman, called me on a Saturday and said, we need you to bring your best sales engineers out to New York and be here first thing Monday morning because we're offline and we need help getting back online. And I thought, well, that's going to be a problem because we don't have any sales engineers. We do now, but we didn't back then. And so we bought a suit for this guy, Shri Rao, who usually shows up to work in camo shorts. And we put him on a plane, and I got on the plane, and we all flew out to New York, and we walked into this bank's office, and we actually ended up meeting with sort of 10 of the largest banks in the world in sort of a 48-hour period. And the very first thing they did was they slid across the table. Here's a version of the logs, and Shri looks at it and goes, oh, these are the Turkish escort attackers. And so, and this has subsequently been reported by the New York Times. It turns out it's probably the same group, probably in Western Iran, an organization that's launched a series of attacks. And because of the fact that we had Turkish escorts on our network, we were able to learn from what was going on and help, in the end, protect much, much larger attackers. Because we see the attacks that are launched at the Israeli Defense Force, we actually are better able to protect Hamas. Because we see the attacks that are launched at Goldman Sachs, we're actually better able to protect, Occupy Wall Street. And so the very nature of what we're doing learns from every piece of data which is coming through us. And as a result, we sort of think that if something's on our network, that's providing value to the network itself and actually making it stronger as a result of it. And that definitely helps shape our perspective on how we're thinking about when content is allowed to be on us versus not allowed to be on us. Most of the troublesome content that that uses it. There's a lot of speculation that troublesome content that uses us we make money off of. That is quite the opposite of the case. In fact, I would be carried around on the shoulders of my ops team if we stopped having some things like Chinese gambling sites, DDoS for hire sites. And in fact, speaking of DDoS for hire sites, this gentleman, Brian Krebs. Brian and I go way back. When he left the Washington Post, I actually tried to hire him to do PR for us, and he said, actually, I think I'm going to try this blog thing. And it's turned out pretty well with Krebs on security, and his sort of bone to pick with us always are DDoS for hire sites, or what are called booter sites. And he was at this conference 2 years ago, and he gave a talk with Lance James where he said, Cloudflare is actually facilitating the DDoS for hire organization, because all of these organizations, even though they can't use Cloudflare's network to actually launch the attacks, they are protected by Cloudflare's network, sort of the user interface for them. And as a result, if Cloudflare just stopped providing services to them, then they would all attack each other and essentially wipe each other out off the internet, which has led to a series of interesting debates. We've actually reached the point where we're discussing Nash equilibriums and whether what would result in this was actually large cartels or not. And I think that's something to be debated. But the real key of this is, and this is what hurts us, and we recognize this, is that it feels like we're being hypocrites, that we're protecting the bad guys. The same thing that happened when we had LulzSec on our network, and the good guys were calling us saying, how can you be protecting the bad guys? And the argument is, and again, when Brian was here, I somewhat rudely, during the Q&A session, took the stage and answered questions using his microphone. So if Brian is here today, he's welcome to do the same again to me. Which only turned out only seems fair play. But Brian's not alone in this. There's a whole website actually which is dedicated to the sites which are on Cloudflare and the troublesome content which is out there. The gentleman which is behind this site, and it's kind of a strange site because it alleges two things simultaneously. One, that we are a honeypot for the CIA, while at the same time that we're anarchists, not responsible to any law enforcement organizations, which I find challenging to keep those two things consistent. The gentleman who's behind this previously had two other websites that he started. One was Google Watch and the other was Wikipedia Watch. And if you think about it, I mean, all three of us are somewhat creepy organizations. Wikipedia purports to be the font of truth for the internet. That's pretty heady stuff. Google, you think about how dependent you are, and we're silently sitting in 5 to 10% of all internet request streams. But what I think, and so there's something to this, but it is really important for these organizations to be trustworthy and trusted because they do sit in a very privileged position. And I don't bemoan the fact that we are critiqued and criticized. It's just like Switzerland. You sign up to be the neutral party, and inherently you're going to piss everyone off. And the hard thing, though, is I don't know a better way to do it. And we have this debate all the time because while there's an easy thing to say, you should kick all the bad sites off your network, it's hard to say what exactly is bad. And I think that actually sets kind of a dangerous precedent. What's happening on a macro level is that the internet used to be extremely decentralized. Anyone could spin up a website anywhere, buy some, an HP server, stick it in a data center, connect to one of many ISPs that were out there, put hardware in front of it to protect it from companies like Cisco and otherwise, and that was how you spun up your systems. What's happening now is that there's a massive consolidation across the industry, and so it's sort of anachronistic to think that you would buy a Dell server anymore if you were starting a project project, you just spin up something on EC2 or DigitalOcean or Microsoft Azure. And while there will be some competition in that space, it's not going to be anything close to the thousands of people from whom you used to be able to buy a server. And it's a different relationship. Once Dell sells you a server, it's your server, and you get to do with it whatever you want. And Dell doesn't have any real ability to go in and snatch anything that they think, if Michael Dell says, gosh, I just really don't like, WikiLeaks. There's no way that he can snatch that back off your server if you're hosting WikiLeaks. On the other hand, when Amazon received a slightly threatening letter, not a court order, not a subpoena, a slightly threatening letter from a junior senator, they took WikiLeaks and kicked them off their network. That's a different level of power that service providers have, and we should all be really cognizant of what the policies are of these service providers as they're making choices for it. Same thing is happening at the network edge, where you used to use services that were provided by the sort of Cisco or Arbor networks or F5s in order to protect the edge of your network. Increasingly, that's going to consolidate around service providers like Cloudflare as well. And so it's Cloudflare, Akamai, Amazon, a relatively limited number of providers, and those become choke points for the internet itself. And if those providers have policies that don't let certain content be on their networks, then that content just might disappear from the internet. And that's what we worry about. And that seems kind of crazy to be talking about at some level, but the trends that we see are that more and more and more of the network is ending up behind these consolidated choke points. And as a result, it's really important for us to think about what the policies of these organizations should be, because they are places that can effectively shut down content online. And what is bad, right? So this is KavetCenter.com. This is reporting on the Chechen rebel movement in Chechnya, a very anti-Russian site. It's labeled a terrorist by the Russian government. Other governments support it and think it's a news organization. On the other hand, the Boston bombers, before they attacked Boston, posted their plans on a forum on this site. So they're a good guy or a bad guy? Don't know. Maka Angola. This is a site which is reporting on alleged government abuse and corruption in Angola. The government is currently trying to hunt down the individual that's behind this site, who is basically in hiding. They think of this as a terrorist site. Are they a good guy or a bad guy? This is the World, I actually don't know how to pronounce this. This is one of the organizations, which is a student group. The only country in the world that thinks of it as a terrorist organization is China, but they think it is a terrorist organization and designate it as such. And so are they a good guy or a bad guy? And again, we can pick all of these different things, and one of the things which has been very apparent in running Cloudflare is that almost every country, almost every organization has a group which is opposite them and that they don't like. And in some cases, again, there are people who personally I find absolutely repugnant. And then the question is, whose policies should actually dictate whether or not that content should be online? Here's one more. This is one of my favorite examples. This is the Muslim Brotherhood, which actually was for a while a terrorist organization in Egypt, and then they became the ruling party of Egypt, and now they're a terrorist organization in Egypt as well. So again, how do you pick who are the good guys and who are the bad guys in these cases? It's not just governments either. So let me tell you a story of a group of princesses. There's a popular forum site which had a particular forum which was dedicated to a certain entertainment company's intellectual property being portrayed in compromising situations. And the certain entertainment company reached out to the forum and said, DMCA, trademark, bad, take it down. And the forum said, fair use, get a court order. And so the particular entertainment company reached out to the CDN provider that was working with them and said, take it down. And the particular CDN provider said, nah, it just doesn't seem right. And the entertainment company said, how much business do we do with you? And how much business does this little forum do with you? And so they took it down. Right? Again, that's the power of being in the stream and the infrastructure. And is that the right way to do it? Again, no court order, no due process, just took it down from a business concern. Another one, and again, this was interesting. There is a certain genre of fantasy fiction that I can't say I understand. And it turns out that it offends someone at a very large both infrastructure company and sort of books and other things organization. And one day, just arbitrarily, they said, you can no longer sell any content on our network which portrays people fantasizing about having sex with dinosaurs. And I think what's sort of strange is I can kind of understand when we get criticized because there are maybe sites on us that portray people fantasizing about having sex with animals or people fantasizing about having sex with children. That really irks me, but I'm not sure who we're worried about in this situation. It's not like the dinosaurs are, again, I think that there's much more risk to the non-dinosaur participant in this. But really, what I think is strange is why this particular fetish is it that is banned from being sold on this particular network. And if the next great novel turns out to have this as a plot point, will we as a society have lost out because Taken by T-Rex doesn't make the New York Times bestseller list. And that, again, is the challenge of the world we're moving into. As we're moving into a world where more and more of the content is actually sitting behind fewer and fewer organizations, those organizations can exercise very substantial and sometimes really arbitrary rules on how they are going to remove that content. You think about your e-reader, and it's pretty amazing that you can buy a book, and then the company behind that e-reader can actually go and snatch that content back to you. It's sort of the digital equivalent of burning books. And again, I don't think that this is I don't want to reduce this to Metcalfe's law, but we do need to make sure that when we're trusting these organizations and providers, we understand what it is that's motivating them, and we hold them accountable for what are sometimes very arbitrary decisions. Which is, of course, just a natural transition to this. About a year and a half ago, my assistant received this email that said, hey, I'm trying to set up a meeting with Mr. Assange and Mr. Prince. Could you tell me when after the 5th of November, which just happens to be Guy Fawkes Day, would suit Mr. Prince? Regards, Joseph, the ambassador to WikiLeaks. And that was sort of an interesting email, and I thought, and I'm pretty good at clearing my inbox out, but it's one that I kept in my inbox for quite some time, and I wasn't going to be in London anytime soon, and I figured that Julian probably couldn't meet me in San Francisco, and so I just hung on to it, and I would show it to people at parties and impress them. And at some point I was in London, and I'd had a pint or two at a pub, and I thought, what the hell? And so I wrote back to Joseph almost a year after he had sent the message originally, and I said, hey, I'm in London for the next 5 days. If Mr. Assange has any availability, I'd be happy to meet with him. Assume that it will be at the Ecuadorian embassy. And Joseph wrote back within 30 minutes and said, be there 4:30, bring ID. And so I went to the Ecuadorian embassy on a Friday afternoon, and if you know London, the Ecuadorian embassy is actually in Knightsbridge. It's in a really nice area of London. It's about a block from Harrods. And I walked in to the Ecuadorian embassy past sort of the many phalanx of MPs that surround it. And the first thing that I noticed is that the Ecuadorian embassy is kept at, I believe, the same temperature that they probably keep embassies in Ecuador. So if you thought that it was all just comfortable living there for the last while Mr. Assange has been there, it probably hasn't been. And I was escorted into a small room, and then the next thing you know, in walked Julian Assange. Which was one of the more surreal moments of starting Cloudflare, and he looks just this intense in person. And he sat down and he said, well, there's sort of three things that I wanted to discuss with you. He said the first is we used to use Cloudflare, and about a year ago when we first sent the email requesting a meeting, we decided to eliminate all US infrastructure providers from our stream, and we were initially going to send out a press release saying, we've done this and shame on the US, but we decided not to because it seems like you guys are doing the right thing, and we didn't want to throw you under the bus. And that actually might be the nicest thing anyone has ever done for me in my life, because that would have been a really bad day. The second thing was, he said, as you might imagine, we use a lot of anonymizing proxies as we surf the internet, given sort of, our situation. And I've really been tracking the rise of Cloudflare over time because you guys put the most annoying CAPTCHAs in front of a ton of the web when you're using the Tor network. And so I have a product request. Could you actually make that better? And I said, sure, I'll take that back to our product team. And we've actually taken quite a few steps to try and make that better. But the third thing was the thing that really stuck with me, and it was so absurd at the time. But I think that it's a great way to think about what's happening to a lot of these infrastructure companies online. The third thing was, he said, have you ever thought about Cloudflare philosophically? And I said, huh? And he said, well, you know how nation states get started? And I said, Mr. Assange, you have really lost me. And he said, well, before there were nation states, individuals were on their own. And the weak would get attacked by the strong, and the strong would beat them up or rob from them or kill them or worse. And eventually the weak get sick of it, and they say, we're going to band together and we'll provide a collective defense together, and we'll have people sort of initially take watch, and then that'll turn into an army someday, and we'll build castles, and that eventually turns into language and turns into religion and turns into culture. It turns into a welfare state to protect the weakest among a system of taxation in order to fund the upkeep of the system, taxing those people that are more wealthy. And I was like, okay, don't understand what this has to do with us. And he said, well, we've always thought about that from a physical perspective. But increasingly, I'm starting to think about that from a digital perspective. And to that end, I think of Cloudflare as the first nation state of the internet. At which point I burst out laughing because that's absurd, except for that it's still stuck with me. And it still makes me think that as in the privileged position where we are, where we have taken a whole bunch of weak organizations, huddled them together, provided a collective defense, starting with Turkish escorts and ending with Goldman Sachs and others, that we have a responsibility as that infrastructure provider to think about what our policies are and be very transparent and very clear about those policies, and more than anything, be extremely consistent and not arbitrary when we think about those policies. And I think that that's something that more and more of the organizations that sit in this trusted position really need to appreciate and think about. And at some level, again, as we watch this transition happen, where we're moving from individual weak parties collecting behind the Cloudflares and the Facebooks and the Googles and the Akamais of the world, it's incumbent on those users, those citizens of these effective nation states, to hold them accountable for what their policies are and decide what those policies are. And different nation states of the internet are going to have different policies. And so ours is not so much around free speech, but really around due process, around an idea that we should be transparent in what it is that we're doing. And we're not anarchists, we're subject to US laws. And our response when we get a questionable site on our network is to reach out to those law enforcement organizations and say, hey, what do you think about this? And if they have a problem, say, then you need to get a warrant, right? You need to get something that shows that we've gone through a democratically sanctioned process in order to decide whether this content is good or bad content. Because there are people whose pay grades are a lot higher than mine that you've all entrusted with determining what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong. And we're going to lean very heavily on that and those institutions. And we're a US-based company, and so we're going to be subject to US-based law. And we're not hiding, and we're not, if you're using us as a means to hide from law enforcement, it's not a very good strategy. But at the same time, that means that if there's an organization on our site that someone doesn't like, I don't care how much customers call us and complain about it. I don't care if it's a certain set of princesses in compromising situations. Until a legitimate court organization actually says you have an obligation to take this site down, then that's what we're going to follow. And that's the consistent policy that we have. And I think that's the only rational policy that's there, because otherwise you end up doing things like banning people fantasizing about having sex with dinosaurs. And again, that's just weird. Now, we try to be consistent with this on the other side of the coin as well. And I'll give you an example of that. One of the things, I think I just lost the mic. One of the things that, do we have? Hello? I'll just speak loudly. One of the things that we recognized was a challenge was that we provide pretty robust enterprise DDoS mitigation service, but it costs a lot. And there are a lot of politically or artistically important sites that can't necessarily afford to pay for that service or that content. And so we said we should do something to help protect these organizations that are doing the right thing, are working in the interest of either our societal interest or our artistic interests, and we should protect them even if they don't have the ability to pay. And so we launched something last year, about a year ago, called Project Galileo. And the idea of Project Galileo was really simple. It was that if you are a politically or artistically important site and you come under attack, we'll protect you, and we'll throw our entire resources behind keeping you, behind keeping you online. But what we really wanted to avoid was, just in the same way we don't want to determine who's bad, and we don't think it's appropriate for us to determine who's bad, we also don't want to be the organization that's determining who's good. It's not the right place for the infrastructure provider for us to say, oh yeah, that's artistically important, but that isn't artistically important. And so the solution that we came up with, I thought, was actually pretty clever, which is we reached out to a number of civil society and NGO partners, companies or organizations that you've all sort of entrusted, and we tried to span the political spectrum here and said, before we accept someone into Project Galileo, you have to vouch for them. And if any one of these organizations vouches for a particular organization that is under attack, then we'll take their word for it, even if we personally, philosophically disagree with what is on that site. And we've tried to live up to that, and I think the best test of this actually was almost the very first test of it, which was we got a call from our friends over at the EFF, and they said, oh my gosh, we have the perfect Galileo customer or user for you. It follows the very principle that bullies shouldn't be able to censor the internet. We'd heard about it originally from, the folks at Occupy Toronto that said Occupy Central needed some protection, and the site in question is popvote.hk. And I remember our policy team came to me and said, hey, we got our first Galileo request, it's popvote.hk, and I was like, is this another Eurovision thing? Is it like a popularity contest? I was imagining it was like a singing contest. Had no idea, right? We're not the most politically astute individuals. In fact, what this was the democracy movement in Hong Kong. And they were planning on having an election, essentially a referendum, to ask whether or not essentially democratic rights should be extended in Hong Kong.
And this was something that the Hong Kong government and the Chinese government were not particularly fans of happening. And so, these were the organizations that came to us and said, you should definitely do it. And we said, sure, if you say this is an organization worth protecting, we're not saying it's good or bad, we're gonna do that. Originally, PopVote had been using Amazon Web Services, but the attack had gotten so large that it was actually causing Amazon Web Services to kick them off, and their Amazon bill was getting out of control. So our first hack was actually convincing Amazon to get them back online. So the back-end infrastructure was hosted on Amazon, and Amazon did a great job of keeping that online. Ahead of the scheduled vote, we saw a very, very large denial of service attacks that were hitting them, largely DNS and NTP reflection attacks, peaking at about 150 gigabits per second. Pretty standard stuff, stuff that today, we see probably on a monthly basis at least. But it was large enough that we were like, wow, they really pissed someone off. We had no idea what was in store for us. Originally, it was going to be us and Google actually helping protect PopVote, and the EFF folks had brought in an organization called Project Shield, which is a project under Google's purview that is similar to Cloudflare. It does DDoS protection, and it's very similar to Project Galileo, where it does it for nonprofit organizations. Unfortunately, the Google team was a little more politically savvy than we are and knew just how big this attack was going to be, and at the last minute said, we're not actually prepared to do this, so you're on your own. That's the point at which we sort of got scared. To make matters worse, the PopVote people decided that, because there might be some sort of outage, that they would extend the vote from 3 days to 10 days. That was the point at which my ops team almost killed me. Thursday night, the 19th of June in San Francisco, the 20th of June in Hong Kong, we actually brought cots in for our team to sleep in the office because some people had made us aware that this might be a fairly large attack. We ordered Chinese food because we thought it was ironic. And we waited for the attack. And about an hour before the voting was supposed to start, the attack started. There's about 100 gigs of DNS reflection, an additional 300 gigs of NTP reflection, a large layer 4 attack with SYN floods over 100 million packets per second. The really nasty part, though, were some of the layer 7 attacks. There's sort of a boring HTTP flood. There was a really interesting HTTPS attack where they actually picked cipher suites that were particularly computationally intensive for us to resolve and sent a whole bunch of requests to that. And that was the point where we're like, wow, there's some smart people on the other side of this. It was really easy to defeat, though. We just turned the cipher suite off. The really scary one, though, was the DNS floods, where we were getting over 250 million valid DNS queries per second from spoofed IP addresses that were being requests for popvote.com. And that was challenging for a couple of reasons. One was there's no way to really filter out you can't tell whether it's a valid request or an invalid request, and so you can't separate those out. The other thing that was particularly pernicious was a lot of the upstream DNS resolvers saw this as an attack against their infrastructure, so they shut them down upstream from us. So even if we had the capability to be able to respond to the attacks at this volume, the upstream providers would keep them offline. And there's still upstream providers in certain regions. I was just in the UK, and you still to this day can't resolve popvote.hk on Virgin's network because they just shut down the ability for it to respond as well. To give you some sense, there was 128 gigs of just DNS requests coming into our network, all of which were valid. It was great to work with the teams at OpenDNS, who's here and again has a really smart team that we work closely with, and then also at Google DNS. And we were able to sideload into them what the updated requests were, make sure that they would continue to resolve that. And the PopVote team on the ground in Hong Kong worked with these teams to be able to do this. So just to give you some sense, this is sort of a graph of what the attack looked like before we stepped in. It was sort of like everything hitting Hong Kong, and then it all basically went away from Hong Kong and it all hit us because we're based in the US. What people didn't know at the time was, well, first of all, would we be able to stay online? And we're pretty proud of the fact that we were able to keep this free customer online for 10 days. There was voting 24/7 throughout it. Over 1 million people voted in the referendum. And, that's culminated in the protests that continue to go on in Hong Kong to this day. What, again, wasn't clear from the outside world was at the same time that we were defending this, we were also working with China to build data centers across mainland China. And that was really complicated. And there was a point in time at which the partnerships that we had struck to put this online and build those facilities online, which are now online, that partnership was really at risk because of that, and that was a real threat not only to us but to our business. And what was pretty compelling and surprising was the thing that finally won the day was we convinced, rightfully so, the organizations that were upset with us, and they were pretty upset. This was a Beijing newspaper that alleged that Cloudflare was a front for the CIA, just like Daniel Brandt and the Cloudflare Watch guys. We finally convinced them that this wasn't political. This wasn't us saying this content is good or bad. This wasn't us endorsing it. This was us simply doing what we said we would do, which is we're going to keep content online. And what was interesting was when Anonymous actually turned around and tried to attack the Hong Kong government became a customer as well, and we protected them from attacks. And so when we get criticism for sites which are on our network, what I hope that you'll bear in mind, because undoubtedly there is something that uses our network that you hate. What I hope you'll bear in mind is that the stakes in this are higher than you think. If we had made determinations of kicking things off before, it would have been much more difficult to have the position that we are actually just this neutral third party. And the minute that we start down that path, there is a slippery slope to a place where we are the ones making that determination on what is good and what is bad. And so instead, what we think of ourselves again as is Switzerland. We think of ourselves as that neutral party, and nobody really likes the Swiss, but they respect them. And I hope that that's kind of the place that we're at as well. Nobody really likes us, but I hope that you respect us. You respect that our positions are consistent and that we're going to follow what we think of as due process. We're going to hand off the decisions on what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do to the legislative, the judicial, the democratically instituted policies that you all have chosen to say you're the ones that are making that determination, and not simply my whims because I wake up one morning and decide that, having sex with dinosaurs is really gross. That fundamentally is what we think of as building trust, and that's what we're going to continue to do. And it doesn't win any popularity contests, but I think it's really important. And as more of the infrastructure of the internet consolidates behind fewer and fewer players, when I'm thinking about who I'm going to use for my infrastructure, I'm thinking more about how can I know that you actually trust that organization? How can I know that that the policies are going to be consistent over time? So I've only left 5 minutes for questions and pitchforking, but if you have any questions, happy to answer them. And if you'll just go to one of the microphones, we can take it from there. But thank you all for coming and listening. I think there's a question here.
So, what I'm curious about is how you deal with requests that we're following a country's due process, where it's a country that we don't have a lot of respect for their legal system, or it's based on morals that don't align with Western morals.
So, there are two different challenges there. So one challenge is we run an infrastructure that has presence in a lot of locations around the world. And in those locations locally, so for example, there is certain content that we cannot announce from inside China. And that's the rule, and we will follow that rule for our infrastructure that is located inside of China. And we do that in other regions where there are particular regulations. But that doesn't mean that that one country should have the ability, in fact, it's impossible for any one country to then dictate what is or is not on the internet as a whole. And so when we do get process from any country that is outside the United States, there actually is a process in the United States where that court's order can be affirmed by the courts inside the United States. And if it goes through that process, then we'll follow what the U.S. court says. But basically, if we've recently had a Brazilian court send an order to us, there's a very established procedure about how that Brazilian court communicates that to a U.S. court. It was around an intellectual property dispute that got relayed to us, and we complied with the order because it then ultimately came from a U.S. court. These processes are in place. We're not having to reinvent the wheel. We're just going to follow what that process is from what our home country is, and then in the regions that we operate in around the world, we'll make regional policy decisions about what content can actually live in that region itself.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So during the keynote and during your speech, you mentioned that centralization is becoming a bigger problem. So I was wondering if you've given any thought to the innovations occurring with blockchain technologies and the decentralization of these services, and if so, what are your thoughts on that?
So I'm kind of two minds on this. On one hand, if I put on my sort of CEO of Cloudflare hat, the centralization of the internet's great. Because you're ultimately going to use Cloudflare or something like us, and we're basically one of the only organizations that's going to be able to protect you. If I take off my CEO of Cloudflare hat and I put on my just citizen of the internet hat, it scares the living shit out of me. Because it puts an enormous amount of power in a much smaller set of hands, and I just worry. I mean, I see internally, like the debates around China for us. It was a hard debate. It was a debate that we went up to our board and we said, are we willing to stand on our principles if it means we lose access to this what's going to be the largest internet market in the world? And the answer was again, we're not. Our principle is simply that we're not picking who the good guys and the bad guys are, and we'll sort of take and we'll follow that. And yeah, if it means that, that's what we'll have to do. But it's tricky in terms of technologies. I mean, I'd love anything that could better decentralize the internet. I think that, and I think that there tends to be this sort of sine wave where we go from massive consolidation to dispersion, We're in a consolidation wave, but I'm hopeful that there will be technology that comes out at some point that makes it so that you don't have to rely on Cloudflare. As again, citizen of the internet, I'm hopeful that we do have a way of dispersing that technology. The challenge, though, is it's really tough to stop without a giant network, a terabit per second DDoS attack. And so until we fix the problems that allow those types of attacks to happen, it's going to be challenging. And then network effects are really powerful, economies of scale are really powerful, and so that's what's going to force a lot of this consolidation. But I do think it's a risk. So.
Question specifically about China and the quote-unquote poisons that the Chinese consider Falun Gong, Tibet, etc. Have you had a case where you have had content that has been from one of the, let's say, groups where they have asked you, hey, you cannot put this up on your facilities inside China, but yet you are hosting it or protecting it on your facilities outside of China? And does that present unique challenges for you where they say, hey, you got to comply with us inside China, which I'm assuming you do, right? But then you're like, no, but it's on another data center somewhere else, and we're going to keep having it. And then would they maybe potentially turn their own state-sponsored resources against that to try to take it down, where they're paying you as a customer? You see what I'm saying? Does that present interesting challenges for you?
So I have 0 minutes left, and that is the structure that we had to enter into in order to have infrastructure that we can use in China is complicated. The short answer is Cloudflare has no operations in China. We partner with somebody that is in China, and we're able to then extend our network onto their network, but it is their determination on whether content is allowed to be on that network or not allowed to be on our network, and we have no influence over that. Because, again, we shouldn't be determining what is allowed and not allowed in China, because we're not the experts in that as well. And so we've handed that off to an organization that's there. What's important, though, is that what's allowed or not allowed in any region, whether it's China or the US or the UK, and frankly, we have a lot more problems with internet restrictions coming out of the UK right now than almost anywhere else on earth, more so than China. That is a determination that should be made in that local region. And again, it will never affect our network as a whole. It will only affect that region and the laws that apply within that region. Thank you very much.